Major Garrett Hollenbeck strode through the supply depot with the confidence of a man who believed logistics personnel existed solely to serve real soldiers. His polished boots clicked against concrete as he approached the requisition desk where Sergeant Nora Caldwell sorted inventory sheets with methodical precision. Supply clerks, he thought, the bottom of the military food chain. Need these requisitions processed immediately, Hollenbeck announced, dropping a stack of forms onto her desk with deliberate force. The papers scattered across her organized workspace. And make sure you get it right this time. Last week's order was completely wrong. Before we dive into this story, drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you've witnessed similar underestimation in your workplace. Caldwell looked up from her computer screen, her expression remaining neutral despite the obvious disrespect. The requisitions from last week were filled exactly as submitted, Major. If there are discrepancies, they originated from the requesting department. Hollenbeck's jaw tightened. Are you questioning my competence, Sergeant? Several other supply personnel had stopped their work to observe the exchange. Corporal Jensen whispered to his companion, "Here we go again." Staff Sergeant Moreau shook her head and returned to her inventory count, unwilling to witness another public dressing down. "I'm simply stating the facts about the requisition process, sir," Caldwell replied calmly. "Each order is double-checked against the original submission before fulfillment." The major leaned across the desk, close enough that his voice would carry to every corner of the depot. "Listen carefully, Sergeant. I've been leading combat operations while you've been counting spare parts and playing with spreadsheets. Don't lecture me about facts when your entire military experience consists of sitting behind a desk." The depot fell silent except for the distant hum of climate control systems. 23 pairs of eyes watched as Hollenbeck straightened his uniform jacket with theatrical precision. Real soldiers understand urgency and accuracy. Supply clerks apparently understand neither. Caldwell's fingers remained steady on her keyboard as she pulled up the requisition system. "I'll process these according to standard procedures, Major. The timeline depends on availability and priority classification." "Standard procedures," Hollenbeck repeated, his voice dripping with contempt. "That's exactly the problem with support personnel. No initiative, no understanding of operational necessity. Just procedures and excuses." He turned toward the small audience that had gathered, clearly enjoying the performance. "This is why combat units have to work around logistics instead of relying on it. Too much time in air conditioning, not enough time understanding what real military service looks like." Staff Sergeant Moreau exchanged a meaningful glance with Corporal Jensen. Both had worked with Caldwell long enough to recognize the controlled tension in her shoulders, the deliberate steadiness of her breathing. Something about the way she absorbed the major's insults suggested depths that Hollenbeck couldn't fathom. The major collected his copies of the requisition forms and prepared to leave, apparently satisfied with his public demonstration of authority. "Get those orders right, Sergeant. And remember that some of us have actual military responsibilities that don't involve sitting in comfortable offices all day." As his footsteps faded toward the depot entrance, the normal bustle of activity slowly resumed. Jensen approached Caldwell's desk with genuine concern. "You okay, Sarge?" She nodded without looking up from her screen. "Just another day in paradise, Corporal." But Moreau had noticed something others missed. During Hollenbeck's entire tirade, Caldwell's eyes had never wavered, never shown the hurt or intimidation the major clearly expected. Instead, there had been something almost like patience, as if she were waiting for something, as if she knew something the rest of them didn't. 3 days later, Major Hollenbeck returned to the supply depot with Captain Reynolds and Lieutenant Vasquez in tow, clearly intending to make another scene. The morning inventory was in full swing when his voice boomed across the warehouse floor. "Sergeant Caldwell, front and center." "Now." Nora looked up from the equipment manifest she was reviewing with Corporal Jensen. The major stood near the main counter with his arms crossed, flanked by the 2 junior officers who looked uncomfortable with whatever was about to unfold. She approached the group with measured steps, her uniform crisp despite having been working since dawn. "Yes, Major." Hollenbeck gestured toward a stack of boxes near the loading dock. Explain to me why my unit received M4 cleaning kits when we specifically requested M16 maintenance supplies. Captain Reynolds shifted his weight nervously. The requisition forms he'd witnessed Hollenbeck filling out had definitely specified M4 supplies, but contradicting a superior officer in public wasn't a career-enhancing move. The requisitions submitted on Monday specified M4 cleaning kits, part number 77 for Alpha, Caldwell replied without hesitation. That's exactly what was delivered to your unit yesterday afternoon. Wrong. Hollenbeck declared loudly enough for the entire depot to hear. My unit operates M16 platforms exclusively. Any competent supply clerk would know that. Lieutenant Vasquez glanced at Jensen, who was pretending to focus intently on his clipboard. Everyone in the depot knew that Hollenbeck's unit had transitioned to M4S 6 months ago, but pointing out the Major's error would require someone willing to challenge his version of events. Major, your unit received M4S during the March refit, Caldwell said evenly. The transition was completed in April. All subsequent supply requests have reflected the new weapon system. Hollenbeck's face reddened visibly. Are you telling me I don't know what weapons my own soldiers carry? The depot had gone completely quiet. Even the forklift operators had stopped their work to watch the confrontation. Staff Sergeant Moreau moved closer, her expression tense with the expectation of escalation. I'm telling you what the records show, sir. If there's been a misunderstanding about your unit's current equipment status, I can pull the transition documentation. The Major stepped closer, using his height advantage to loom over her. Listen very carefully, Sergeant. I've been in combat zones while you've been playing with inventory databases. I think I know the difference between an M4 and an M16. Captain Reynolds caught Lieutenant Vasquez's eye and shook his head slightly. Both officers had been present during the weapons transition and knew exactly which platform their unit currently used. Documentation doesn't change reality. Caldwell, Hollenbeck continued. Real soldiers adapt to circumstances instead of hiding behind paperwork. That's something support personnel never seem to understand. He turned to address the assembled depot staff directly. This is exactly why logistics fails combat units. Too much faith in computers, not enough understanding of actual military operations. Corporal Jensen watched Caldwell's reaction carefully. Her posture remained perfectly at attention, but something in her eyes suggested she was calculating rather than simply enduring, as if she were measuring the Major's performance against some internal standard. I'll verify the requisition against your unit's current tenue, Major, she said. If there's been an error in our records, we'll correct it immediately. Of course you'll verify it, Hollenbeck sneered. That's all you people know how to do. Verify, process, file, repeat. Meanwhile, real soldiers are making decisions that actually matter. The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of trucks arriving at the loading dock. Captain Reynolds cleared his throat softly, hoping to signal that perhaps the demonstration had made its point. But Major Hollenbeck wasn't finished. He'd found an audience and intended to use it. Supply clerks like Sergeant Caldwell here represent everything wrong with modern military logistics. No initiative, no operational awareness, just blind adherence to procedures that don't reflect battlefield reality. Staff Sergeant Moreau had worked logistics for 15 years and had never seen an NCO absorb this level of public humiliation with such composed dignity. Most soldiers would have either broken down or fought back by now. Caldwell simply stood there, absorbing every word as if she were filing it away for future reference. The Major collected his officers and headed toward the exit, apparently satisfied with his latest performance. Get those records straight, Sergeant, and try to remember that some of us have real work to do. As the sound of their footsteps faded, the normal rhythm of depot operations slowly resumed. But Jensen noticed that several of the senior NCOs were exchanging looks that suggested this situation was far from over. The following Friday brought Major Hollenbeck's most ambitious performance yet. He arrived during the weekly supply briefing, when representatives from every unit on base gathered in the depot's main conference room. 37 personnel sat around tables reviewing distribution schedules when Hollenbeck made his entrance. Before we begin today's briefing, he announced without invitation, "I think everyone should be aware of the ongoing competency issues we're experiencing with depot personnel." Colonel Martinez, the senior logistics officer conducting the meeting, looked up from his presentation materials with obvious irritation. "Major, this isn't the appropriate venue for personnel concerns." "Actually, sir, I believe it is," Hollenbeck replied, positioning himself at the front of the room. "When supply failures impact multiple units, it becomes everyone's problem." Sergeant Caldwell sat in the back row with her tablet, taking notes on the distribution schedule. She hadn't looked up when Hollenbeck entered, but her fingers had stopped moving across the screen. "Sergeant Caldwell has consistently demonstrated an inability to process straightforward requisitions," the major continued. "Last week alone, my unit received incorrect supplies 3 separate times." Captain Torres from the motor pool raised his hand. "Major, our unit has worked with Sergeant Caldwell for 18 months. We've never experienced any processing errors." Hollenbeck waved dismissively. "Perhaps your unit's requirements aren't as complex as a combat logistics operation, Captain." The room's atmosphere grew increasingly uncomfortable. Master Sergeant Walsh, who supervised depot operations, shifted in his chair and glanced at Colonel Martinez. The colonel's expression suggested he was rapidly losing patience with the major's unauthorized presentation. "The problem with support personnel like Caldwell," Hollenbeck pressed on, "is they lack operational experience. They process paperwork without understanding battlefield implications." First Sergeant Reeves from the engineering battalion leaned forward. "Major, what exactly are you proposing?" "I'm proposing that combat units receive priority handling from personnel who actually understand military operations, not desk jockeys who've never left the continental United States." The silence that followed was deafening. 37 pairs of eyes turned towards Sergeant Caldwell, who remained focused on her tablet, as if the major were discussing weather patterns rather than her professional competence. Lieutenant Morris from Aviation Logistics couldn't remain quiet. "Sir, Sergeant Caldwell processed our emergency parts request last month in record time. Without her intervention, we would have lost 2 aircraft to maintenance delays." Hollenbeck spun toward Morris with visible annoyance. "Lieutenant, you're missing the bigger picture. Individual successes don't overcome systemic incompetence." Colonel Martinez finally stood up. "Major Hollenbeck, you're out of line. This briefing has a specific agenda, and personal grievances aren't on it." But the major wasn't finished. He'd gathered the largest audience possible and intended to maximize the impact. "Everyone in this room has experienced supply delays and processing errors. Most of you just accept it as normal because you don't realize logistics could actually function efficiently with proper leadership." Master Sergeant Walsh had supervised depot operations for 8 years and had never witnessed such a blatant public attack on one of his NCOs. He started to rise from his chair, but Caldwell caught his eye and shook her head almost imperceptibly. Supply clerks hide behind regulations and procedures instead of solving problems, Hollenbeck continued. Real soldiers find ways to accomplish the mission despite administrative obstacles. Captain Torres stood up abruptly. "Major, I'm going to stop you right there. Sergeant Caldwell has consistently exceeded every standard metric for supply processing efficiency. Your accusations are completely unfounded." The major's face flushed red. "Captain, when you've led soldiers in actual combat situations, then you can lecture me about military competence." "Sir," Torres replied coldly, "I spent 14 months in Afghanistan leading a logistics convoy team. I know exactly what real military service looks like." The room erupted in uncomfortable murmurs. Several officers exchanged glances that suggested Hollenbeck had finally crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Colonel Martinez slammed his hand on the table. "Major, you're dismissed. Report to my office immediately after this briefing." But Hollenbeck had already achieved his objective. 37 personnel had witnessed his systematic demolition of Sergeant Caldwell's reputation. As he gathered his materials and headed for the exit, he threw one final comment over his shoulder. Some of us remember when military logistics actually functioned effectively, before it became a welfare program for personnel who couldn't handle real military occupational specialties. The door slammed behind him, leaving the briefing room in stunned silence. Colonel Martinez took a deep breath and returned to his presentation materials, but the damage had been done. Everyone present had witnessed the most public humiliation possible in military culture. Caldwell continued taking notes as if nothing had happened, but Staff Sergeant Moreau noticed her handwriting had become slightly more deliberate, more controlled, as if she were consciously maintaining composure through sheer force of will. The next morning brought an unexpected development that began to shift perceptions among the depot staff. Captain Torres arrived at the supply office with an urgent request for specialized equipment his aviation unit needed within hours, not days. Sergeant Caldwell listened to his requirements with the same methodical attention she gave every request, but Torres noticed something different in her questions. She asked about specific aircraft configurations, maintenance schedules, and operational timelines with a precision that surprised him. "Your unit operates the Alpha variant Blackhawks, correct, Captain?" she asked, pulling up technical specifications on her screen. "The new rotor assembly requires specific torque settings that differ from the standard variant." Torres paused mid-sentence. "How did you know about the Alpha variant modifications? That information isn't in standard supply databases." Caldwell's fingers moved across her keyboard with practiced efficiency. "I stay current on platform specifications. It helps prevent compatibility issues during emergency requisitions." But Torres had worked aviation logistics for 6 years and knew that staying current on classified aircraft modifications required access levels far beyond typical supply personnel. The Alpha variant specifications were restricted information. "The parts you're requesting won't work with your current configuration," she continued. "You need the specialized mounting brackets, part number 88937. They're in limited inventory, but I can prioritize your request." Within 20 minutes, Caldwell had assembled a complete parts package that Torres hadn't even known he needed. Every component was precisely matched to his unit's specific aircraft configuration, down to the individual serial numbers. "Sergeant," Torres said slowly, "where exactly did you learn about Alpha variant specifications?" She looked up from her screen with the same neutral expression she'd maintained during all of Hollenbeck's attacks. "Technical manuals, sir. I read them during off-duty hours." But Torres knew those technical manuals were classified above her clearance level. Someone with her security rating shouldn't have access to Alpha variant documentation. Yet she demonstrated intimate knowledge of systems that required years of specialized training. The parts arrived at his unit 2 hours later, perfectly packaged and accompanied by installation guides that included modifications Torres hadn't seen before. His maintenance chief, Master Sergeant Kelly, examined the documentation with growing amazement. "Where did this installation guide come from?" Kelly asked. "This isn't standard technical documentation. This is field expedient modification guidance that would only come from someone with extensive hands-on experience." Torres returned to the supply depot that afternoon with questions that had been bothering him all day. He found Caldwell training Corporal Jensen on inventory management procedures, and what he observed made him even more curious. She was explaining supply chain logistics with a sophistication that went far beyond basic depot operations. Her knowledge of transportation networks, distribution priorities, and resource allocation suggested experience with large-scale operations planning. "Sergeant," Torres interrupted, "can I speak with you privately?" They stepped into a small office adjacent to the main supply floor. Torres closed the door and studied her carefully. "I've been working aviation logistics for 6 years, and I've never met a supply clerk who understood Alpha variant specifications." Caldwell's expression remained neutral. "I study technical publications to better serve customer requirements, Captain. Those publications are classified above your security level," Torres pressed. "And the installation guidance you provided included field modifications that aren't documented anywhere in official manuals." For the first time since he'd known her, Torres saw something flicker in Caldwell's eyes. Not defensiveness or discomfort, but a kind of careful calculation, as if she were deciding how much truth to reveal. Some guidance comes from practical experience, Captain. Not everything valuable is found in official documentation. What kind of practical experience? Torres asked directly. The door opened before she could answer, and Staff Sergeant Moreau entered with inventory reports. Sorry to interrupt, but these reconciliation figures need review before the afternoon briefing. Torres left the depot with more questions than answers, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Sergeant Caldwell was far more than she appeared. Her knowledge base, her calm under pressure, and her ability to solve complex problems suggested capabilities that didn't match her current assignment. That evening, he called his friend Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, who worked personnel assignments at the Pentagon. Jim, I need you to run a routine background check on someone. Just basic service record information. Hayes laughed. Since when do you care about background checks, Torres? Since I met a supply sergeant who knows more about classified aircraft specifications than most pilots. The line went quiet for several seconds. Torres, that's not something you joke about. I'm not joking, Hayes. Something doesn't add up here. After hanging up, Torres sat in his quarters, staring at the technical documentation Caldwell had provided. Every page demonstrated knowledge that should have been impossible for someone with her apparent background and security clearance. But more troubling was the memory of her expression when he'd pressed her about practical experience. For just a moment, he'd seen something that looked less like a supply clerk and more like someone accustomed to making decisions under pressure. Someone who'd learned to keep secrets. Major Hollenbeck's campaign against Sergeant Caldwell intensified the following week when he discovered that Captain Torres had publicly praised her work during unit commanders' meeting. The major interpreted this as a direct challenge to his authority and decided to escalate his tactics accordingly. He arrived at the supply depot during the busiest part of the day when multiple units were processing requisitions and the staff was stretched thin. Perfect timing for maximum visibility and disruption. Sergeant Caldwell, step away from that computer immediately, he commanded, his voice cutting through the normal bustle of activity. The entire depot fell silent as personnel stopped their work to witness another confrontation. Caldwell finished entering the current requisition before looking up. Yes, Major. Hollenbeck pulled a thick folder from under his arm and slammed it onto her desk. These are supply discrepancies from the past month. Every single error traces back to your processing failures. Staff Sergeant Moreau glanced at the folder with confusion. She handled quality control for all depot operations and knew the error rate for the past month had been less than 2%, well below acceptable standards. Major, our monthly error analysis shows performance within normal parameters, Moreau said carefully. Normal parameters for incompetent operations. Maybe, Hollenbeck replied, without taking his eyes off Caldwell. But combat units require perfection, not acceptable mediocrity. He opened a folder and pulled out several requisition forms, spreading them across her workspace. Explain to me why my unit received the wrong quantities on these orders. Caldwell examined each form methodically. These orders were filled exactly as submitted, Major. The quantities match your original requisitions precisely. Wrong again, Hollenbeck declared loudly. My unit needed different quantities than what we received. Any competent supply clerk would have recognized the discrepancy and corrected it. Corporal Jensen looked up from his workstation with obvious confusion. Supply personnel were required to fill orders exactly as submitted. Making unauthorized changes to requisition quantities would violate multiple regulations. Sir, we're required to process orders as written, Jensen said quietly. Changing quantities without authorization would be inappropriate. Hollenbeck spun toward Jensen with visible anger. Corporal, when you've had actual military experience beyond this air-conditioned warehouse, then you can lecture me about appropriate procedures. The major turned back to Caldwell, who remained seated calmly despite the escalating aggression. This is exactly what I'm talking about. Blind adherence to procedures instead of thinking about operational requirements. He leaned across her desk, close enough that everyone could hear his words clearly. Real soldiers anticipate needs and solve problems. Supply clerks just follow orders without understanding why those orders matter. Master Sergeant Walsh had supervised depot operations long enough to recognize when a situation was approaching dangerous territory. He stepped closer to the confrontation, ready to intervene if necessary. Major, if there are concerns about processing procedures, those should be addressed through proper channels, Walsh said diplomatically. Professionals. Ulyambek rapata mukingli. More bureaucracy from people who don't understand urgent operational requirements. He pulled another document from his folder and waved it in front of Caldwell's face. Yesterday, my unit requested expedited processing for critical supplies. Instead of prioritizing a combat unit's needs, Sergeant Caldwell here processed routine requests first. The depot staff exchanged confused glances. Expedited requests always received priority processing, regardless of which units submitted them. It was one of the most basic protocols in supply operations. Major, expedited requests are automatically prioritized in our system, Caldwell said evenly. If your supplies weren't processed immediately, it's because they weren't submitted with expedited classification. Are you calling me a liar, Sergeant? The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Everyone present understood that challenging a major's honesty was career suicide, regardless of the facts involved. I'm explaining our processing procedures, sir. If you'd like to review the electronic submission records, they're available for inspection. Hollenbeck's face flushed red with rage. Electronic records can be manipulated, Sergeant. What matters is that my soldiers didn't receive critical supplies when they needed them. Captain Torres entered the depot during this exchange and immediately recognized the hostile atmosphere. He'd come to thank Caldwell personally for the aviation parts that had saved his maintenance schedule, but now he found himself witnessing another public humiliation. The major noticed Torres' arrival and decided to expand his audience. Captain, you're just in time to witness another example of supply incompetence. Torres looked at the scene carefully. Caldwell sat with perfect military bearing despite obvious harassment, while Hollenbeck loomed over her desk in a posture of naked aggression. Actually, Major, Torres said slowly, I came here to thank Sergeant Caldwell for exceptional service. Her processing of our emergency requisition exceeded every standard for efficiency and accuracy. Hollenbeck's expression darkened further. Captain, you're obviously not familiar with the broader pattern of failures we're discussing here. The major gathered his papers and prepared for his dramatic exit. Until supply personnel start thinking like soldiers instead of clerks, combat units will continue to suffer from logistics failures. As he stormed toward the exit, Hollenbeck delivered his final insult loud enough for the entire depot to hear. Some people are cut out for real military service, and others are just good enough for counting inventory. The critical supply situation emerged on a Tuesday morning when Colonel Martinez received an urgent communication from Pacific Command. A joint training exercise involving 3 allied nations required immediate logistical support, and the base had 72 hours to coordinate complex supply chains across multiple time zones. The emergency briefing convened at 0700 hours with representatives from every major unit on base. Colonel Martinez stood at the front of the packed conference room, his expression grim as he outlined the scope of the challenge. Gentlemen and ladies, we have been tasked with supporting Operation Pacific Unity, a multinational exercise involving American, Japanese, and Australian forces. The logistics requirements are unlike anything we've handled before. Major Hollenbeck sat in the front row, confident that his combat experience would make him indispensable during the crisis. Behind him, Captain Torres noticed that Sergeant Caldwell had been included in the briefing, unusual for supply NCOs unless their expertise was specifically needed. The operation requires coordination of ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, and specialized equipment across 3 different military logistics systems, Martinez continued. Each nation has different specifications, different procedures, and different security requirements. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, who had flown in from the Pentagon specifically for this briefing, added his own concerns. The political implications of failure are significant. Any supply chain breakdown could undermine allied relationships that took years to build. Hollenbeck raised his hand immediately. Sir, my unit has extensive experience with complex logistics operations. We could take point on coordinating the combat-related requirements. Colonel Martinez nodded diplomatically. Major, we'll certainly need your unit support. However, this operation requires specialized knowledge of international supply protocols. Master Sergeant Walsh leaned over to whisper something to the colonel, who listened carefully before nodding. Sergeant Caldwell, please brief the group on the compatibility issues we're facing. Every head in the room turned toward the supply NCO, who had been sitting quietly in the back row. Caldwell stood and moved to the front of the room with the same calm confidence she displayed during all of Hollenbeck's attacks. The primary challenge is ammunition compatibility, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the room. Japanese and Australian forces use different specifications for small arms ammunition, even when the weapons platforms appear identical. She moved to the whiteboard and began sketching supply chain diagrams with practiced precision. The 5.56 NATO rounds used by Australian forces have different pressure specifications than Japanese variants. Mixing them could cause weapon malfunctions or worse. Captain Torres watched in amazement as Caldwell outlined logistics complexities he hadn't even considered. Her knowledge of international military specifications was encyclopedic, covering everything from fuel additives to medical supply storage requirements. Additionally, she continued, Japanese forces require specific cold storage protocols for their medical supplies that differ from American standards. Australian equipment uses metric threading that's incompatible with our standard tools. Major Hollenbeck's expression grew increasingly uncomfortable as Caldwell demonstrated expertise far beyond anything he'd expected from a supply clerk. Her briefing covered aspects of international military cooperation that required years of specialized training. The fuel compatibility issues are particularly complex, Caldwell explained. Each nation's aircraft required different fuel additives, and cross-contamination could ground entire squadrons. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes interrupted with obvious interest. Sergeant, how familiar are you with OPSEC requirements for multinational operations? Without hesitation, Caldwell outlined security protocols that covered classified information sharing, personnel clearance procedures, and equipment access restrictions. Her knowledge was so detailed that several officers began taking notes. Colonel Martinez watched the briefing with growing appreciation. Sergeant Caldwell will coordinate the international compatibility requirements, while Major Hollenbeck handles combat logistics for American forces. But Hollenbeck wasn't finished challenging her expertise. Sergeant, explaining protocols is different from implementing them under pressure. Have you ever actually managed international supply operations? The question hung in the air as everyone waited for her response. Caldwell paused for just a moment, and Torres saw that same calculating expression he'd noticed before. I have experience with multinational logistics coordination, Major. Enough to understand the complexities involved. What kind of experience? Hollenbeck pressed, sensing an opportunity to expose her limitations in front of the assembled commanders. Practical experience, sir. The kind that comes from managing supply chains in challenging environments. The room fell silent as officers processed this exchange. Master Sergeant Walsh looked at Colonel Martinez with raised eyebrows. Both men were beginning to realize that Sergeant Caldwell might not be exactly what she appeared. Hayes pulled out his secure phone and began typing a message. Something about her knowledge base was triggering questions that needed immediate answers from personnel records that weren't available at base level. Colonel Martinez concluded the briefing by assigning specific responsibilities to each unit, but the dynamic in the room had shifted. Major Hollenbeck's confident assumption of leadership had been quietly overshadowed by a supply sergeant who demonstrated expertise that seemed impossible given her apparent background. As the officers filed out, Torres lingered to speak with Caldwell privately. Where exactly did you learn about international ammunition specifications? She gathered her materials with the same methodical precision she applied to everything else. Research, Captain. Lots of research. Major Hollenbeck's frustration reached a boiling point as the international operation entered its second day and Sergeant Caldwell's coordination efforts continued to exceed expectations. Every supply challenge that arose seemed to find immediate resolution through her intervention, while his own attempts to assert authority met with polite but firm resistance from Allied logistics officers. The breaking point came during the afternoon coordination meeting when Australian Major Thompson addressed a fuel compatibility crisis directly to Caldwell rather than routing the request through Hollenbeck's chain of command. "Sergeant," Major Thompson said over the secure video link, "our ground crews are reporting issues with the fuel additive you specified. Can you walk us through the mixing procedures again?" Hollenbeck stood up abruptly, positioning himself between Caldwell and the camera. "Major Thompson, all coordination requests should be directed through appropriate command channels. I'll handle this fuel issue." The Australian officer looked confused. "Major Hollenbeck, with respect, Sergeant Caldwell has been our primary point of contact for technical specifications. She's already resolved 3 compatibility issues for us today." "That's exactly the problem," Hollenbeck replied, his voice rising with barely contained anger. "Support personnel shouldn't be making decisions that affect combat operations." Captain Torres and Master Sergeant Walsh exchanged concerned glances from across the room. The Major's public contradiction of established coordination procedures was creating diplomatic complications with their allies. "Major," Caldwell said quietly, "the Australian forces need immediate guidance on fuel mixing ratios. We can address chain of command issues later." "We'll address them now," Hollenbeck snapped, turning away from the video conference to face her directly. "You're a supply clerk, not an operations coordinator. Stay in your lane." Major Thompson's voice came through the speakers with obvious confusion. "I'm sorry, but we have aircraft that need fuel within the hour. Can someone please clarify who has authority to approve these procedures?" The room fell into uncomfortable silence as Hollenbeck realized his authority challenge had created exactly the kind of international incident Colonel Martinez had warned against. Allied forces were watching American personnel engage in jurisdictional disputes instead of solving operational problems. "Sergeant Caldwell has technical authority for compatibility issues," Colonel Martinez said from the back of the room, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Major Hollenbeck coordinates American force logistics. But Hollenbeck couldn't let the slight pass without response. "Sir, respectfully, technical specifications mean nothing without operational context. Combat experience provides that context." He turned back to the video conference, addressing Major Thompson directly. "Major, I've led logistics operations in 3 combat zones. I understand operational pressures that support personnel have never experienced." Major Thompson's expression grew increasingly uncomfortable. "Major Hollenbeck, we simply need fuel mixing guidance. This seems like a straightforward technical issue." "Nothing is straightforward in combat logistics," Hollenbeck replied. "Every decision has tactical implications that require military judgment, not just technical knowledge." Caldwell remained seated at her workstation, calmly reviewing fuel specification documents, while Hollenbeck continued his impromptu lecture on operational complexity. Her composure under increasing pressure was beginning to draw attention from personnel throughout the room. The sergeant's calm professionalism contrasted sharply with the major's agitated performance, and several officers were starting to wonder why a supply clerk seemed more comfortable with international coordination than a supposed combat logistics expert. Japanese Colonel Nakamura joined the video conference and immediately addressed Caldwell directly. "Sergeant, our medical supply storage requirements conflict with Australian protocols. Can you recommend a solution?" Before she could answer, Hollenbeck moved closer to the camera. "Colonel Nakamura, all medical supply decisions require medical officer approval. I'll coordinate with our flight surgeon." But Colonel Nakamura persisted. "Sergeant Caldwell resolved similar issues yesterday. Her recommendations were precisely what our medical staff needed." The room's atmosphere grew increasingly tense as Allied officers continued directing questions to Caldwell, while Hollenbeck insisted on inserting himself into every exchange. His attempts to establish authority were creating exactly the kind of coordination delays that could jeopardize the entire operation. Staff Sergeant Morrow watched the developing crisis with growing concern. She'd worked with Caldwell long enough to recognize the subtle signs of controlled frustration. The sergeant's patience was wearing thin, and something in her posture suggested capabilities that went far beyond typical supply operations. Master Sergeant Walsh approached Colonel Martinez quietly. "Sir, we have a diplomatic situation developing here. Allied forces are losing confidence in our coordination capabilities." Martinez nodded grimly. The Major's territorial behavior was undermining relationships that took months to establish. More importantly, it was threatening the success of an operation with significant strategic implications. "Major Hollenbeck," the colonel said formally, "report to my office immediately. Master Sergeant Walsh will assume coordination responsibilities for American logistics." Hollenbeck's face reddened with humiliation as he realized he'd been relieved of his primary responsibility in front of Allied commanders. But instead of accepting the decision gracefully, he chose to escalate further. "Sir, removing experienced combat leadership in favor of support personnel sends the wrong message to our allies about American military competence." The video conference fell completely silent as Allied officers witnessed an American major publicly challenging his superior's direct order. The diplomatic implications were staggering, and everyone present understood that careers were being damaged in real time. Colonel Martinez's voice dropped to a level that suggested immediate and serious consequences. "Major, you're dismissed. Report to my office now." As Hollenbeck gathered his materials and headed for the exit, his final comment carried enough volume to ensure everyone heard clearly. "Someday our allies will understand the difference between real military leadership and administrative convenience." The international operation concluded successfully 48 hours later, with Allied commanders specifically requesting Sergeant Caldwell's contact information for future coordination efforts. The smooth resolution of complex logistical challenges had impressed military officials from 3 nations, but Major Hollenbeck wasn't finished with his campaign against their competence. He waited until the post-operation briefing to make his move, arriving early to position himself strategically in the main conference room. When Colonel Martinez began reviewing the mission's success metrics, Hollenbeck was ready with his alternative narrative. "Sir, while the operation achieved its objectives, I believe we need to address some concerning procedural violations that occurred during the coordination phase." Martinez looked up from his notes with obvious irritation. "Major, what procedural violations are you referring to?" Hollenbeck stood and moved to the front of the room, clearly intending to address the assembled officers directly. During critical decision points, support personnel exceeded their authority by making operational commitments without proper approval. Captain Torres shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He'd witnessed most of the coordination activities and knew that Caldwell had followed established procedures precisely while solving problems that had stumped more senior personnel. Specifically, Hollenbeck continued, "Sergeant Caldwell made fuel specification decisions that should have required engineering officer approval. She committed medical supply resources without consulting medical personnel." Master Sergeant Walsh raised his hand. "Major, all of Sergeant Caldwell's decisions were within established technical parameters. She consulted appropriate specialists whenever required." But Hollenbeck had prepared for resistance. "Technical parameters don't address tactical implications, Master Sergeant. Every supply decision affects operational readiness in ways that support personnel can't fully understand." He pulled out a folder containing documentation he'd compiled over the past 2 days. These coordination transcripts show multiple instances where Sergeant Caldwell exceeded her authority by providing guidance that should have come from qualified officers. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, who had observed the entire operation from the Pentagon, leaned forward with interest. "Major, can you provide specific examples of inappropriate guidance?" Hollenbeck flipped through his papers with theatrical precision. On Tuesday afternoon, she authorized fuel mixing procedures for Australian aircraft without consulting our aviation fuel specialists. Actually, Major, Captain Torres interrupted, I was present for that conversation. Sergeant Caldwell consulted with Staff Sergeant Murphy from Fuel Systems before providing those specifications. Hollenbeck's expression darkened as his carefully prepared accusations met immediate contradiction. Perhaps Captain Torres wasn't aware of the broader pattern of unauthorized decision-making. He continued reading from his documentation. Wednesday morning, she committed medical supplies to Japanese forces without medical officer approval. Colonel Martinez checked his own notes. Major, those medical supplies were pre-approved by Captain Wesley from the flight surgeon's office. The authorization is documented in the coordination logs. The room's atmosphere grew increasingly uncomfortable as Hollenbeck's accusations fell apart under scrutiny. Several officers were beginning to realize that the major had spent considerable effort trying to build a case against someone whose performance had been exemplary. Staff Sergeant Morrow watched Caldwell's reaction carefully. Throughout Hollenbeck's presentation, the sergeant had remained focused on her post-operation reports, showing no visible response to the accusations being leveled against her. But Master Sergeant Walsh had worked logistics long enough to recognize something troubling about Hollenbeck's behavior. The major's obsession with undermining a subordinate NCO was approaching pathological levels, especially given her demonstrated competence. Major, Walsh said carefully, Sergeant Caldwell's coordination efforts received specific commendation from Allied commanders. Australian Major Thompson requested her direct contact information for future operations. That's exactly the problem, Hollenbeck replied, his voice rising with frustration. Allied forces are bypassing proper American command structures because they've been dealing directly with support personnel. He turned to address Colonel Martinez directly. Sir, this sets a dangerous precedent. If we allow NCOs to represent American logistics capabilities to foreign militaries, we undermine officer authority and command structure. The colonel's expression suggested he was rapidly losing patience with the major's continued challenges to established operations. Major Hollenbeck, Sergeant Caldwell operated under my direct authority throughout this operation. Her actions reflected my decisions and priorities. But Hollenbeck couldn't abandon his position without losing face completely. Sir, respectfully, command authority means ensuring that qualified personnel make critical decisions. Support clerks shouldn't be the face of American military logistics to Allied forces. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes looked up from his tablet, where he'd been taking notes throughout the exchange. Major, I've reviewed the coordination transcript from the Pentagon. Sergeant Caldwell's performance exceeded expectations at every level. He paused and looked directly at Hollenbeck. In fact, Japanese and Australian logistics officers specifically requested her involvement in future joint operations. The room fell silent as the implications became clear. Allied military forces had been so impressed with Caldwell's expertise that they wanted to work with her again, while the major who'd tried to marginalize her was building cases against imaginary procedural violations. Colonel Martinez closed his folder with finality. Major, this briefing is concluded. Sergeant Caldwell, excellent work on a complex operation. But as officers began filing out, Hollenbeck made one final attempt to salvage his campaign. He approached Martinez privately and spoke loudly enough for nearby personnel to hear. Sir, I'm concerned that we're setting dangerous precedents by allowing support personnel to exceed their traditional roles. Combat effectiveness depends on maintaining clear distinctions between leadership and support functions. Martinez turned to face him with an expression that could have frozen motor oil. Major, report to my office at 0th tomorrow. We need to discuss your continued insubordination and unprofessional conduct. The security clearance review that would change everything began 3 days later when Lieutenant Colonel Hayes received a request from Pacific Command for detailed personnel files on Operation Pacific Unity coordinators. Allied forces wanted to formalize future cooperation agreements, which required complete background verification for all American personnel involved. Hayes arrived at the base personnel office early Friday morning with a list of names requiring immediate security review. The process was routine for most personnel, But when he reached Sergeant Caldwell's file, the system prompted him for additional authorization codes. Interesting, he murmured, typing in his elevated clearance credentials. Most supply personnel didn't require special access protocols for file review. The initial screen showed standard information. Nora Caldwell, Supply Management Specialist, assigned to Logistics Depot for 18 months. But when Hayes clicked for detailed service history, the system requested verification from multiple security databases. Master Sergeant Chun, who supervised personnel records, looked over his shoulder with curiosity. "Sir, that's unusual. Standard personnel files don't require multiple authentication levels." Hayes entered his Pentagon access codes and waited while the system processed his request. Something about Caldwell's background was triggering security protocols he'd rarely encountered outside of Special Operations personnel files. The first authentication cleared, revealing assignment history that made Hayes pause. Instead of the typical supply chain training and depot assignments he'd expected, Caldwell's record showed a gap of nearly 4 years, with only cryptic location codes. Chun leaned closer to the screen. "Sir, those assignment codes don't match any standard logistics postings. They look like overseas special operations designations." Hayes felt his pulse quicken as he recognized the implications. Special operations assignment codes were restricted information that required specific clearance levels to access. A supplies sergeant shouldn't have that kind of background in her file. The second authentication request appeared, asking for Hayes's specific purpose in accessing classified service records. He typed in his official justification and submitted the request to the Pentagon Security Office. While waiting for clearance approval, Hayes reviewed what information was available in the unclassified sections. Caldwell's performance evaluations were consistently outstanding, but the language used by her rating officials suggested responsibilities far beyond typical supply operations. Her supervisors repeatedly mentioned operational planning capabilities, crisis management under pressure, and expertise in specialized logistics applications. The terminology was subtle but specific, indicating familiarity with military operations that most supply personnel never encountered. Chen pointed to a notation in the margin of one evaluation. "Sir, what does cleared for special project coordination mean in a supply context?" Hayes had seen similar language before, but only in files of personnel with special operations backgrounds. Special project coordination was often code for classified mission support that couldn't be detailed in standard personnel documentation. His secure phone buzzed with a message from Pentagon Personnel Security. Clearance approved for limited access to classified service records. The authorization came with a warning that the information was compartmentalized and required special handling procedures. Hayes opened the classified section of Caldwell's file and immediately understood why Major Hollenbeck's accusations had seemed so absurd to anyone with actual operational experience. The woman he'd been dismissing as an incompetent supply clerk had a service record that most combat officers would envy. Chen's eyes widened as the details appeared on screen. "Sir, these assignment locations include some of the most classified special operations bases in the world." The file revealed overseas deployments to locations that didn't officially exist, coordination responsibilities for operations that remained classified years after completion, and training certifications and specialties that were restricted to elite military units. Hayes scrolled through page after page of documentation that painted a completely different picture of Sergeant Caldwell's capabilities. Her knowledge of international military protocols wasn't academic research. It was practical experience gained through years of coordinating complex special operations across multiple theaters. Master Sergeant Chun read over his shoulder with growing amazement. "Sir, according to this record, she coordinated logistics support for classified operations involving special forces from 12 different countries." Hayes found the section detailing her transition to conventional assignments and understood immediately why she'd been placed in supply logistics. After years of high-stress special operations coordination, many personnel requested assignment to lower-profile positions to decompress from the constant pressure. But the file also contained a notation that explained her current security status. Personnel with her background often maintained cover assignments that allowed them to utilize their specialized skills without drawing attention to their true capabilities. Chen looked up from the screen with obvious concern. "Sir, Major Hollenbeck has been publicly attacking someone with one of the most distinguished special operations support records I've ever seen." Hayes realized the diplomatic implications immediately. Allied commanders hadn't been impressed with a talented supply clerk. They'd been working with one of the most experienced international operations coordinators in the American military. The file contained letters of commendation from general officers, Allied military commanders, and special operations units whose names were still classified. Caldwell's expertise wasn't theoretical knowledge gained from technical manuals. It was hard-won experience from coordinating some of the most complex military operations of the past decade. Hayes printed the portions of the file that could be shared with Colonel Martinez and prepared to make a phone call that would fundamentally change the situation at the logistics depot. Major Hollenbeck had been systematically attacking someone whose classified background made his own service record look pedestrian by comparison. Chen shook his head as he secured the classified documents. "Sir, someone needs to brief the colonel on this immediately. The major's behavior could create serious problems if word gets back to the special operations community." Hayes was already dialing Martinez's direct line, knowing that the conversation he was about to have would end Major Hollenbeck's campaign against Sergeant Caldwell permanently. Colonel Martinez received Lieutenant Colonel Hayes's urgent phone call during his Monday morning staff meeting, and the conversation that followed sent shockwaves through the base command structure. Hayes requested an immediate private meeting to discuss classified personnel matters that could not be discussed over unsecured communications. Within an hour, Martinez found himself in a secure conference room reviewing documentation that fundamentally altered his understanding of the situation in his logistics depot. Hayes spread Caldwell's classified service record across the table with the reverence reserved for explosive materials. "Jim," Martinez said slowly, "please tell me you're not showing me what I think you're showing me." Hayes pointed to the first page of the classified file. "Tom, Sergeant Caldwell isn't just any supply and CO. She's arguably one of the most experienced special operations logistics coordinators in the entire military." Martinez studied the documentation with growing disbelief. The service record revealed deployments to classified locations that most general officers never saw, coordination responsibilities for operations involving elite units from allied nations, and security clearances that exceeded those of most field-grade officers. She coordinated logistics support for Operation Silent Thunder. Hayes continued, referring to a classified mission that Martinez recognized from intelligence briefings. That operation involved special forces from 8 different countries operating in hostile territory for 6 months. The colonel's hands shook slightly as he read through page after page of commendations from commanders whose names were legendary in special operations circles. Letters of appreciation from British SAS officers, Australian Special Air Service commanders, and elite units from nations that didn't officially acknowledge their special operations capabilities. "Tom," Hayes said quietly, "Major Hollenbeck has been publicly humiliating someone who coordinated logistics for missions that are still classified above his security level." Martinez found the section detailing Caldwell's transition to conventional assignments and understood immediately why such an experienced operator would request assignment to routine logistics work. After years of coordinating life-or-death operations under extreme pressure, many special operations personnel sought lower-profile assignments to recover from chronic stress. But the file also contained recent correspondence that explained her continued value to the special operations community. Multiple classified units had requested her services for future operations, indicating that her skills remained in high demand despite her current assignment. "Jim," Martinez said, his voice barely above a whisper, "does Major Hollenbeck have any idea what he's been doing?" Hayes shook his head grimly. Based on his behavior, he clearly believes he's dealing with an incompetent supply clerk. He has no concept of her actual background or capabilities. The colonel found the section documenting Caldwell's specialized training and felt his stomach drop. Advanced crisis management, international protocol certification, classified communications procedures, and coordination techniques that were restricted to personnel supporting the most sensitive military operations. She's trained in crisis management protocols that most colonels never see, Hayes explained. Her expertise in international military coordination comes from actually coordinating with elite units from allied nations during combat operations. Martinez realized the diplomatic implications of Hollenbeck's behavior. If word of his treatment reached the special operations community, it could damage relationships with allied forces who had worked directly with Caldwell during classified missions. Tom, Hayes continued, there's something else you need to know. Her current assignment isn't random placement. She's maintaining a cover position that allows her to utilize specialized skills without drawing attention to her background. The colonel looked up from the files with obvious concern. Are you telling me she's still involved in classified operations? Not directly, Hayes replied, but personnel with her background often serve as resources for situations requiring specialized expertise. Her knowledge base makes her valuable for contingencies that regular logistics personnel couldn't handle. Martinez thought back to the international operation and realized why Caldwell's performance had impressed Allied commanders so thoroughly. She hadn't been demonstrating exceptional talent for a supply clerk. She'd been operating at her normal professional level. The documentation revealed that her expertise in international ammunition specifications, fuel compatibility protocols, and medical supply procedures came from years of coordinating complex operations where mistakes could compromise missions and endanger lives. Jim, Martinez said, his voice heavy with the implications. Major Hollenbeck's behavior could be seen as compromising operational security by drawing attention to classified personnel. Hayes nodded soberly. If her background becomes common knowledge because of his harassment, it could affect her ability to serve in future special operations support roles. The colonel closed the classified files and leaned back in his chair, processing the magnitude of the situation. A field-grade officer with combat experience had spent weeks systematically attacking one of the most qualified logistics specialists in the military. Tom, Hayes said quietly, there's one more thing. Pacific Command specifically requested her background information because Allied commanders want to work with her again. They're planning to formally request her involvement in future multinational operations. Martinez realized that while Hollenbeck had been trying to undermine her credibility, Caldwell's reputation with Allied forces had been growing to the point where she was becoming a strategic asset for international cooperation. The irony was devastating. The Major's campaign to expose her supposed incompetence had been conducted against someone whose actual competence exceeded his own by orders of magnitude. His public attacks on her capabilities would seem laughably ignorant to anyone who knew her real background. Jim, Martinez said finally, I need to handle this situation very carefully. Major Hollenbeck's behavior has created problems far beyond what he could possibly understand. The confrontation that would end Major Hollenbeck's campaign began Tuesday morning when Colonel Martinez summoned him to his office for what the Major assumed would be a routine discussion about logistics efficiency. Hollenbeck arrived with renewed confidence, believing that time had vindicated his concerns about support personnel overstepping their authority. He knocked on Martinez's door precisely at the appointed time, straightened his uniform, and entered with the bearing of an officer who expected validation for his vigilance in maintaining military standards. Sir, Major Hollenbeck reporting as ordered, he announced, taking position at attention in front of the colonel's desk. Martinez gestured toward a chair without looking up from the classified folder spread before him. The Major's confidence began to waver slightly as he noticed the serious expression on his commander's face and the official documentation that covered the desk. Major, Martinez said slowly, we need to discuss your conduct regarding Sergeant Caldwell over the past several weeks. Hollenbeck straightened in his chair, interpreting the opening as an opportunity to present his case against her competence. Sir, I believe my concerns about support personnel exceeding their authority have been validated by recent events. The colonel looked up from his papers with an expression that made Hollenbeck's next words die in his throat. Major, Before you continue, I want you to understand that this conversation is being conducted under the authority of classified personnel security protocols. A chill ran down Hollenbeck's spine as he realized this wasn't the discussion he'd anticipated. Classified personnel security protocols were reserved for situations involving special operations personnel or sensitive intelligence matters. Major, Martinez continued, I'm going to share information with you that is classified above your current security level. This information is being provided solely to help you understand the gravity of your recent conduct. Hollenbeck's mouth went dry as the colonel opened the folder and began reading from documents that bore security classifications he'd never seen before. His confident assumptions about the conversation's direction crumbled as he realized he was about to learn something that would change everything. Sergeant Nora Caldwell, Martinez read aloud, has spent the past 8 years coordinating logistics support for classified special operations involving elite units from 12 allied nations. The words hit Hollenbeck like physical blows. Special operations coordination required security clearances and experience levels far beyond anything he'd imagined possible for a supply sergeant. Her service record, the colonel continued, includes direct coordination with British Special Air Service, Australian Special Operations Command, and classified units from NATO countries during combat operations in restricted theaters. Hollenbeck's hands began to tremble as the implications became clear. The woman he'd been dismissing as an incompetent clerk had been coordinating logistics for some of the most elite military units in the world. Martinez turned a page and continued reading. Letter of commendation from General Morrison, commanding Special Operations Command Pacific. Outstanding performance coordinating complex international logistics during Operation Silent Thunder. The major's face had gone completely white. Operation Silent Thunder was a classified mission he'd heard referenced in intelligence briefings, but had never been cleared to know details about. Letter of appreciation from Colonel Whitfield, British Special Air Service, the colonel read. Sergeant Caldwell's expertise in international logistics coordination exceeded expectations and contributed directly to mission success. Hollenbeck tried to speak, but found his voice had abandoned him entirely. The systematic demolition of his assumptions continued as Martinez read through page after page of commendations from commanders whose names were legendary in military circles. Advanced certification in crisis logistics management, international protocol coordination, and classified communications procedures. Martinez continued relentlessly. Specialized training in coordination techniques restricted to special operations support personnel. The major finally found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. Sir, I had no idea about any classified background. Martinez looked up from the documents with an expression of controlled fury. Major, you publicly humiliated one of the most experienced special operations logistics coordinators in the American military. You questioned her competence in front of Allied commanders who knew her reputation. The colonel stood and moved around his desk to loom over the trembling major. Your behavior could have compromised operational security by drawing unwanted attention to classified personnel maintaining cover assignments. Hollenbeck's mind raced as he tried to process the magnitude of his error. Every public attack he'd made on her competence would seem laughably ignorant to anyone who knew her real background. Every criticism of her lack of operational experience had been directed at someone whose operational experience exceeded his own by orders of magnitude. Major, Martinez said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, Pacific Command has specifically requested Sergeant Caldwell's involvement in future multinational operations. Allied commanders consider her a strategic asset for international cooperation. The room fell silent except for the sound of Hollenbeck's labored breathing as he realized his career had just imploded. His systematic campaign against someone he'd assumed was beneath his notice had actually been an attack on someone whose value to the military far exceeded his own. Martinez returned to his desk and closed the classified folder. Major, you will report to personnel immediately to begin out-processing procedures. Your conduct has demonstrated unfitness for continued service in a leadership capacity. But the final blow was still coming. The colonel picked up his phone and dialed an extension. "Sergeant Caldwell, please report to my office immediately." Hollenbeck sat frozen in his chair as footsteps approached down the hallway. In moments, he would face the woman whose reputation he had tried to destroy, knowing now that she possessed qualifications and experience that made his own service record seem insignificant by comparison. The door opened, and Sergeant Caldwell entered with the same calm professionalism she had maintained throughout weeks of his attacks. But now Hollenbeck saw something different in her bearing, something he'd been too arrogant to recognize before. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to making decisions under pressure that most people couldn't imagine. Sergeant Caldwell entered Colonel Martinez's office and immediately assessed the situation with the tactical awareness that had kept her alive during years of classified operations. Major Hollenbeck sat slumped in his chair, his face ashen and his hands trembling slightly. The classified folder on the colonel's desk told her everything she needed to know. "Sergeant," Martinez said, his voice carrying the weight of recent revelations, "Major Hollenbeck has just learned about your actual service background." She looked at Hollenbeck with the same calm expression she'd maintained throughout weeks of his harassment. But now he could see what he'd been too blind to recognize before. Her composure wasn't the patience of someone absorbing undeserved criticism. It was the professional tolerance of someone who had dealt with far more serious threats than an insecure field-grade officer. "Major," she said quietly, her voice carrying just enough inflection to suggest years of command presence training. Hollenbeck tried to meet her eyes, but found himself looking away in shame. The woman he'd spent weeks publicly humiliating as an incompetent supply clerk had coordinated logistics for special operations missions he'd never been cleared to know existed. "Sergeant Caldwell," Martinez continued, "Major Hollenbeck will be transferring to a new assignment where his talents might be better utilized. I wanted him to apologize personally before his departure." The major struggled to find words that could possibly address the magnitude of his error. Every public attack on her competence had been witnessed by personnel who now knew the truth about her background. His reputation was destroyed beyond any possibility of repair. "Sergeant," Hollenbeck began, his voice cracking with humiliation, "I owe you an apology that I don't know how to give." She nodded once, acknowledging his words without providing the absolution he desperately sought. Years of special operations had taught her that some mistakes carried consequences that apologies couldn't erase. "I had no idea about your background," he continued, grasping for explanations that might mitigate his behavior. "Your performance seemed beyond what I expected from supply personnel." Caldwell's expression didn't change, but Martinez detected the slightest hint of irony in her response. "Major, my performance was exactly what you would expect from someone with appropriate training and experience." The simple statement carried devastating implications. She hadn't been demonstrating exceptional ability for a supply clerk. She'd been operating at her normal professional level, which happened to exceed his comprehension of what logistics coordination could accomplish. Hollenbeck realized that every criticism he'd made of her lack of operational awareness had been directed at someone whose operational experience spanned classified missions across multiple theaters. His lectures about real military service had been delivered to someone whose service record included commendations from general officers he'd never meet. Colonel Martinez stood and moved to his window overlooking the logistics depot. "Sergeant, Pacific Command has formally requested your involvement in upcoming multinational operations. Allied commanders specifically asked for you by name." She nodded professionally, but Hollenbeck caught a glimpse of something that might have been satisfaction. The international recognition of her capabilities provided vindication that his harassment had failed to diminish her professional standing. "Major," Martinez said, turning back toward the trembling officer, "your out-processing begins immediately. Master Sergeant Walsh will escort you to personnel." As if summoned by the colonel's words, Walsh appeared in the doorway. His expression toward Hollenbeck carried the contempt that senior NCOs reserve for officers who abuse their authority against competent subordinates. "Sir," Walsh said to Martinez while pointedly ignoring the major, The depot staff has requested permission to hold a recognition ceremony for Sergeant Caldwell's exceptional performance during the international operation. Martinez smiled for the first time since the conversation began. Approved, Master Sergeant. Make sure our allied contacts are invited. They'll want to participate in recognizing her contributions. Hollenbeck watched this exchange with growing horror as he realized his campaign against her had not only failed, but had inadvertently highlighted her capabilities to personnel who now understood her true value. Before we conclude, Martinez said, addressing Caldwell directly, "Is there anything you'd like to say to Major Hollenbeck?" She considered the question carefully, her tactical mind weighing options with the same precision she'd applied to logistics coordination under hostile fire. When she spoke, her words carried the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected lives. "Major," she said, looking directly at him for the first time since entering the office, "leadership requires understanding your personnel's capabilities before making judgments about their competence." The statement was professional and measured, but it cut deeper than any angry response could have. She was offering him a lesson in leadership that came from years of coordinating with elite units, where incompetent officers didn't survive long enough to harm others. If you enjoyed this story, please drop a comment and let us know your favorite moment, or if you've witnessed someone underestimated based on their current role. As Walsh escorted Hollenbeck from the office, the major caught a final glimpse of Caldwell reviewing operational documents with Martinez. She had returned to her work with the same professional focus she'd maintained throughout his harassment, as if his weeks of attacks had been merely a minor distraction from her actual responsibilities. The depot staff who witnessed his departure understood that justice had been served. The major who had spent weeks questioning a decorated veteran's competence was leaving in disgrace, while she remained to continue work that contributed to national security in ways he'd never comprehend. Within hours, word had spread throughout the base about the true identity of the supply sergeant whom Hollenbeck had publicly humiliated. Personnel who had witnessed his attacks now understood they had seen something unprecedented. A field-grade officer systematically destroying his own career by targeting someone whose qualifications exceeded his own by orders of magnitude. The recognition ceremony held the following week drew attendees from Allied military commands who had worked with Caldwell during classified operations. Their presence provided unmistakable validation of her professional standing and served as a permanent reminder of how catastrophically wrong assumptions about competence could be.